By the time Mara Voss stood before the judge, nobody in Ashford was calling her a survivor anymore. Not the woman who had climbed out of a broken childhood, not the soft-spoken advocate who stood behind church podiums and told frightened women they deserved to be believed. Not the face of Safe Harbor House, where people sent checks and prayers because Mara made mercy sound like a name. They called her something else now. A liar. A fraud. A woman who had learned how to make truth kneel. Behind the prosecutor sat Aaron Pike, thinner than photographs printed the year he was taken away. He had lost years of his life to a story Mara knew was not whole. Beside him sat his sister, Nina, holding a folder until the edges bent. A few rows back, Cassie Rowe stared at the floor, still unsure which memories belonged to her and which ones had been placed in her mouth by the person she once trusted most. At the end of the bench sat Helen Ward, the retired caseworker who had been the first adult to believe Mara when nobody else would. The prosecution said Mara had chosen which truths were useful, which names could be sacrificed, and which frightened voices could be shaped until they served her version of the truth. She had buried contradictions under the language of trauma, and when Aaron Pike's name became convenient, she let an incomplete story become a prison door. Mara understood the cruelest part. For the first time in her life, people were calling her a liar when the word was true. But before the court files, before the altered statements, before testimony that would steal a man's freedom and fracture a young woman's mind, there had been a little girl with a blue notebook. At 8 years old, Mara wrote down the things adults refused to hear. Dates, doors closing, her mother's face turning away. The words a teacher said when Mara tried to explain why going home made her stomach hurt. She believed that if she wrote the truth clearly enough, somebody would have to believe her. Nobody did, and maybe that was where the first crack opened. Mara did not grow up learning that lies were better than truth. She grew up learning something more dangerous. That truth only mattered when someone powerful enough decided who was allowed to speak it. The judge did not raise his voice when he spoke Mara's name. That made it worse. There was no thunder in the courtroom, no dramatic pause, no anger large enough for Mara to hide behind. Just a tired man in a black robe reading from pages that had taken years to build and only minutes to say aloud. He said the case was not simply about stolen money, false statements, or damaged records. Those words were legal enough to fit inside folders. What Mara had done reached further. She had taken the language people used when they were afraid and turned it into a lock. She had taught a town that compassion without truth could become another kind of cruelty. Aaron Pike sat still while the judge spoke. Prison had taught him how to keep his face quiet, but his sister Nina did not look away. Her eyes stayed on Mara with the exhausted steadiness of someone who had spent years being called bitter for refusing to stop asking questions. Cassie Rowe twisted a tissue until it came apart in small white pieces. She was 26 now, older than the terrified young woman who had first walked into Safe Harbor House, but she still looked like somebody waiting for permission to trust her own mind. Helen Ward was harder. Helen had once sat beside Mara in waiting rooms, school offices, county buildings, and diners that smelled like old coffee. Helen had believed that if she could keep one child from disappearing inside the system, every failure before Mara might hurt less. Now Helen sat with her hands folded, looking not angry, but emptied. The judge said Mara's childhood would be considered. The court did not ignore what had happened to her, or what had failed to happen when adults should have stepped in. But pain, he said, did not give any person the right to build a life out of other people's ruin. Mara heard that sentence clearly. For a moment, she wanted to hate him for it. Then she looked at Aaron's face and could not. Because there had been a time when all Mara wanted was for one adult to say something that simple. Not maybe. Not we will look into it. Not are you sure. Just a clear sentence that placed harm on the side where it belonged. She had been 8, the first time she tried to make the world that clear. Back then, Ashford felt smaller than it looked on a map. The town sat between wet hills and narrow roads, with a dollar store, 2 churches, a laundromat, and houses that seemed to lean away from winter. People knew which children came to school hungry or silent. They also knew when not to ask too much. Mara lived with her mother, Elaine Voss, in a white house with green shutters and a porch that sagged in the middle. Elaine worked at a laundromat and carried herself like a woman always listening for something to break. She could braid Mara's hair before school and still turn away whenever Mara tried to speak about the parts of the house that felt unsafe. Family business stays family business, Elaine would say. Mara did not understand what that meant. She only understood that the truth changed shape when her mother entered a room. A closed door became nothing. A frightened night became a bad dream. A question from a teacher became Mara being dramatic again. So Mara wrote things down. She wrote dates. She wrote the color of the sky. She wrote words because she believed exact words had power. Her blue notebook became a place where the truth could not be interrupted, corrected, or smiled away. One Thursday in October, Mara showed that notebook to Mrs. Landry, her third-grade teacher. Mrs. Landry read 3 pages. Her face changed, not enough for the other children to notice, but enough for Mara to feel hope rise. For the rest of that morning, Mara believed she had done it. She had made the truth clear enough. But after lunch, Elaine came to the school office wearing her laundromat uniform and a tired, embarrassed smile. Mrs. Landry spoke softly. Elaine nodded. Someone said Mara had a vivid imagination. Someone said stress could make children confused. Someone said they would keep an eye on things. Then Mara was sent home with her mother. In the car, Elaine did not yell. She only gripped the steering wheel and said, "Do you know what people will think of us now?" Mara looked down at the notebook in her lap. That was the first lesson. The truth had not failed because it was false. It had failed because the wrong person had spoken it. After that October afternoon, Mara learned to become careful with the truth. Not silent. Silence was too obvious. Silent children made teachers lean closer, made church ladies whisper, made people ask questions they did not truly want answered. Mara learned something more useful than silence. She learned how to give people a version of herself they could accept. At school, she became the girl who finished her worksheets early and erased every mistake until the paper almost tore. She returned library books on time. She said thank you to the cafeteria worker even when lunch was a hard roll and a scoop of beans cooling on a plastic tray. She smiled when Mrs. Landry asked if things were better at home. "Yes, ma'am," Mara said. Mrs. Landry looked relieved. That relief stayed with Mara longer than the question. It taught her that adults did not always want the truth. Sometimes they wanted permission to stop worrying. At home, Elaine Voss kept moving, as if movement itself could hold the house together. She washed other people's sheets at the laundromat, counted coins in a coffee can, and stood at the kitchen sink with her shoulders tight whenever Mara came too close to saying something real. Elaine was not the kind of mother who never touched her child. She could press a warm hand to Mara's forehead when she was sick. She could leave the bigger piece of toast on Mara's plate. She could hum old hymns while braiding Mara's hair before Sunday service. That was part of what confused Mara. If Elaine had been only cruel, Mara might have understood the shape of the world sooner. But Elaine's love arrived in pieces, and every piece came with a rule. Do not make the house look worse than it already is. Ashford was small enough that shame traveled faster than weather. A woman could be late on rent and hear about it from a cashier before sundown. A child could come to school with the same sweater 3 days in a row and see the knowledge pass from teacher to teacher without anyone saying a word. Mara watched people notice things. She watched them choose not to know them. On Sundays, Reverend Mercer spoke about mercy from a pulpit polished by old hands. After church, women bent down to Mara and asked how school was going. Men nodded at Elaine and said she was doing the best she could. That phrase followed Mara like a shadow. Doing the best she could. It sounded kind. It also closed every door. Because if Elaine was doing the best she could, then Mara's need for more became an accusation. If the adults around them were doing the best they could, then Mara's fear had nowhere to go except back inside her body. So she kept writing. The blue notebook lived under the loose corner of her mattress. Mara wrote in pencil because pen felt too permanent and too dangerous. She recorded small things with the seriousness of a clerk keeping county records. The day Mrs. Landry looked away in the hallway. The day Elaine told her that some truths ruined families. The day a neighbor paused at the porch steps, heard something through the door, and then decided to keep walking. Mara did not have the words for betrayal yet. She only knew that every time someone almost helped, and then did not, something inside her grew colder and more exact. The next winter, a county worker came to the house. Her name was Denise Koppel. She wore flat shoes, carried a brown folder, and smelled faintly of peppermint gum. Mara remembered the gum because she had trained herself to remember details. Details were proof. Details meant she was not making things up. Denise sat at the kitchen table while Elaine apologized for the mess. Though the house had been scrubbed so hard, the air smelled like bleach. Mara sat across from them with her hands folded under her legs. She could feel the blue notebook hidden beneath the mattress in the back room, as if it had a heartbeat of its own. Denise asked questions in a voice that was not unkind. Did Mara feel safe at home? Did she have enough to eat? Was anyone hurting her? Each question seemed to open a door. But every time Mara looked at Elaine, the door narrowed. Elaine's face had gone soft and wounded, the face she used when other people were watching. Mara said, "I don't know." Denise wrote something down. Years later, Mara would remember that moment with a bitterness that had grown teeth. She would tell herself Denise had failed her. And maybe Denise had. But the harder truth was that Mara had also begun to understand the power of withholding. She had learned that not answering could make adults lean forward. It could make them wonder. It could make them uncomfortable in ways a plain answer did not. She was still a child. It was not a crime to be frightened. But the pattern began there, in that kitchen washed clean for inspection. Truth, silence, suggestion, and the strange power of making other people fill in the empty spaces. Denise left, without taking Mara with her. For 3 days afterward, Elaine barely spoke. Then, on the 4th night, she sat on the edge of Mara's bed and said, "You think people out there will love you better? They won't. They'll ask their questions, write their papers, and go home. I am the only person you have." Mara stared at the wall until her eyes burned. She wanted to hate her mother completely. Instead, she believed her. That was another wound. Not the loudest one, but one of the deepest. Elaine did not just teach Mara that truth was dangerous. She taught her that abandonment could wear the face of protection. By the time Mara turned 12, her notebook was half full. The early pages were simple, almost childish. Later pages changed. They became cleaner, sharper. Mara began rewriting entries so they made more sense. She crossed out sentences that sounded weak. She replaced, "I was scared" with, "I knew something was wrong." She replaced maybe with, "I remember." At first, she did it because she wanted the truth to survive. Then she did it because the edited version made her feel stronger. One afternoon, Mrs. Landry found Mara crying in the girls' bathroom. The teacher knelt beside her, older now, tired in a way Mara had not noticed before. "You can tell me, Mrs." Landry said. Mara looked at her and felt nothing warm. There had been a time when those words would have opened her chest. Now they sounded late. Worse than late. They sounded like a person trying to become brave after the child had already learned not to need bravery from her. Mara wiped her face. Then she told Mrs. Landry a story that was mostly true, but arranged in a way that made the teacher cry. When Mrs. Landry reached for her hand, Mara let her. She felt guilty for a moment. Then she felt something else beneath the guilt. Control. That day did not make Mara a criminal. It did not make her unforgivable. She was still a wounded child trying to survive a world where adults had failed at the simplest job. But something had shifted. Mara no longer believed the truth had to be clear. She believed it had to be effective. The night Mara finally left Elaine's house, nobody called it a rescue. That was the first thing she noticed. There were no arms opening. No one knelt in front of her and said she had been brave. No one took the blue notebook from her hands and promised that every page mattered now. There was only a cruiser parked crooked beside the mailbox, its red and blue lights turning the White House strange colors. A neighbor stood across the road in a bathrobe, pretending not to watch. Elaine sat on the porch steps with her face in her hands, crying hard enough that one of the deputies spoke to her gently. Mara stood near the kitchen doorway, holding a trash bag with 3 shirts inside. For years, she had imagined that if the truth ever became loud enough, the world would know who needed help and who had failed to give it. But when the county worker arrived, when the deputies asked questions, when Elaine shook her head and said she did not know how things had gotten so out of hand, everything blurred. Mara was not carried out like someone saved. She was processed. At the county office, a woman with tired eyes asked Mara to repeat herself. Then again. Then one more time. The room smelled like old carpet and copy machine heat. A clock clicked above the door. Mara stared at it whenever she forgot what came first. The woman was not cruel. That made it harder to hate her. She only kept asking for dates, names, sequences, exact words. Mara had trained herself to remember details, but fear had a way of scattering them. The more she tried to be perfect, the more her own story seemed to move around inside her mouth. "So that was Monday?" the woman asked. Mara hesitated. "Or Tuesday? I don't know." The woman wrote something down. Mara watched the pen move and felt something close inside her. She had thought the notebook would make the truth solid. Instead, every page became something to examine, compare, doubt, and file. Adults did not hold truth carefully. They held it up to the light and looked for cracks. By morning, Mara was placed with the Pritchards, a foster family who lived 20 minutes outside Ashford in a yellow ranch house with clean windows and a freezer full of casseroles from church. Mrs. Pritchard had soft gray hair and a habit of speaking before she touched anyone, as if asking permission from the air. "I put towels on your bed," she told Mara. "Bathroom's down the hall. You don't have to talk tonight." Mara did not answer. Mr. Pritchard was quieter. He worked for the county road department and smelled like cold air and motor oil when he came home. He did not ask Mara what happened. He only showed her how the back door locked and said, "You can use the porch light if you get scared at night." It should have made her feel safe. Instead, safety made Mara suspicious. At Elaine's house, fear had rules. You learned the floorboards. You learned the moods. You learned which silences meant danger and which ones meant the house was only tired. But the Pritchards' house had no familiar warning signs. It had folded laundry, a jar of peppermint candies, and a guest room where nobody opened the door without knocking. Mara lay awake the first week waiting for kindness to change shape. It did not. Mrs. Pritchard packed her lunch in a brown paper bag and wrote her name on it. Mr. Pritchard left a small flashlight on her nightstand after Mara admitted she did not like the dark. On Saturday, they drove her to a thrift store and let her choose a coat without complaining about the price. Each gentle thing should have built trust. Instead, each one added pressure. Mara began to feel watched by their goodness. Every clean towel, every warm plate, every quiet knock on her door seemed to ask a question she could not bear. "Are you the kind of child people can keep?" She already believed the answer was no. So she decided to find out before they did. The object was small enough to fit in her palm, a silver locket Mrs. Pritchard kept in a dish near the kitchen sink. It had belonged to her mother. Mara had seen Mrs. Pritchard touch it twice when she thought no one was looking. Mara did not want to sell it. She did not even want it. She wanted the house to reveal itself. She took the locket and hid it behind a loose panel in the closet of her room. The moment she did, guilt rose so quickly that she almost put it back. Her hand was already on the closet door when she heard Mrs. Pritchard humming in the kitchen. The song was soft, trusting. Mara shut the closet. For 2 days, nothing happened. Then Mrs. Pritchard began searching. She checked the kitchen counters, the bathroom drawer, the laundry basket. By evening, the humming stopped. "Have you seen my locket?" she asked Mara. Mara looked at her face and saw no accusation there. That made the lie easier and harder at the same time. "No," Mara said. Mrs. Pritchard believed her. For a few hours, Mara felt powerful in a way she did not understand. The house held its breath because of something she had done. People moved carefully because of a secret she controlled. No one had listened when she told the truth, but a hidden lie had changed the air in every room. Then Mr. Pritchard found the locket while repairing the closet panel. He did not shout. Mrs. Pritchard sat at the kitchen table with the locket in front of her, and Mara hated her for looking sad instead of angry. "If you wanted to look at it," Mrs. Pritchard said, "you could have asked." Mara shrugged, though her throat hurt. "I didn't take it." The lie came out flat. Mr. Pritchard closed his eyes. Mrs. Pritchard's face changed then. Not into cruelty, into disappointment. Somehow, that was worse. "Mara," she said softly, "we can work with mistakes. We can't work with you lying to our faces." There it was. Not "we are sending you away." Not "you are bad." Only a sentence about trust. But Mara heard the ending before anyone said it. She heard the car door, the county office, the trash bag. She heard Elaine's voice telling her no one out there would love her better. By the next week, the placement was marked unstable. The official reason included behavioral concerns, adjustment difficulties, dishonesty. The words looked clean on paper. They did not show Mrs. Pritchard standing in the hallway the morning Mara left, holding a lunch bag she had packed anyway. They did not show Mara refusing to take it because accepting it would have meant admitting she had wanted to stay. In the car, the case aide tried to comfort her. Sometimes the first placement just isn't the right fit. Mara looked out the window and decided that was another way adults lied kindly. The truth was simpler. The Pritchards had opened a door, and Mara had broken the handle to prove it was never really open. But she could not let herself know that yet. So she rewrote the story before anyone else could. By the time she reached the next foster home, Mara had decided Mrs. Pritchard cared more about a necklace than a child. Mr. Pritchard had been waiting for an excuse. The county had never planned to let her stay. It was not completely true. It was not completely false. That was the kind of story Mara was beginning to trust most. The kind with enough truth to hurt and enough missing pieces to protect her from blame. Mara was 15 the first time Helen Ward found her. Not saved her. Found her. Mara would understand the difference later. It was raining that night. The kind of cold Appalachian rain that made the pavement shine beneath gas station lights and turned every passing car into a smear of white and red. Mara had been gone from her third foster placement for almost 9 hours. She had no plan beyond not going back. Her shoes were soaked. Her backpack held 2 shirts, the blue notebook, and a granola bar she had stolen from a pantry because hunger made pride feel childish. She ended up at a diner near Route 16, sitting in the last booth with her hands wrapped around a paper cup of water. The waitress had already looked at her 3 times. Mara knew the look. Adults had different versions of it, but the question was always the same. How much trouble will this child become if I care? When Helen Ward walked in, Mara expected a county worker with a clipboard voice. Someone tired. Someone annoyed. Someone ready to say Mara had made this harder than it needed to be. Helen was tired, but not in that way. She was in her late 50s, with silver hair pinned at the back of her head and a brown coat darkened at the shoulders from rain. She spoke to the waitress first, quietly. Then she came to Mara's booth and sat across from her without touching the backpack, the notebook, or Mara herself. "You hungry?" Helen asked. Mara stared at her. "No lecture?" Helen looked at the menu. "Soup first. Lecture later, if you're still interested." Mara did not smile, but something inside her loosened by one small thread. Helen ordered tomato soup, toast, and coffee for herself. She did not ask why Mara ran. She did not ask whether the foster parents were cruel or whether Mara had done something wrong. She let the silence sit on the table between them like another plate. That was new. Most adults treated silence as a locked door they had to force open. Helen treated it like weather. Present, uncomfortable, but not permanent. When the soup arrived, Mara ate too quickly and burned her tongue. Helen pretended not to notice. That kindness, small and undramatic, nearly made Mara cry. Nearly. She had learned to be careful with tears. Tears made adults soft, but they also made them powerful. A crying child handed other people the right to decide what the crying meant. After a while, Helen said, "I read your file." Mara's spoon stopped. "There it is," Mara said. "There what is?" "The file. That's me, right?" Helen folded her hands around her coffee cup. "No, it's paper about you. That's not the same thing." Mara looked away. The sentence was too gentle. She did not trust it. Helen went on. "I also know paper can miss things. Sometimes it gets things wrong. Sometimes it records what adults understood, not what a child lived." For one dangerous second, Mara wanted to tell her everything. Not the arranged version, not the sharpened version, the messy one. The one with missing days, mixed up details, shame, anger, and all the places where Mara herself had done things she did not know how to explain. Instead, she tested Helen. She told her about the Pritchards, but changed the locket into a bracelet. She said Mrs. Pritchard screamed, though she had not. She said Mr. Pritchard called her a thief, though he only looked tired and disappointed. She made the story cleaner than life had been. Easier to understand. Easier to choose sides. Helen listened without interrupting. When Mara finished, Helen did not accuse her. She only asked, "Was it a locket?" Mara froze. What? The item you took. In the file, it says lock it. The shame hit first. Then rage came to cover it. So you do think I'm a liar. I think you are scared, Helen said. Mara laughed once, sharp and ugly. That's what people say when they mean liar but want to sound nice. Helen did not flinch. No. When I mean liar, I say liar. The booth went quiet. Mara waited for the punishment. The note in the file. The call back to the Foster house. The change in Helen's face that would prove the whole bowl of soup had been a trick. It did not come. Helen took a slow breath and said, Mara, I do not need you to be perfect to believe that you were hurt. That sentence found a place in Mara that had never been spoken to directly. She hated Helen for it. She needed Helen for it. Both feelings arrived together, and Mara did not know how to hold them without turning one into a weapon. Over the next months, Helen became the only steady adult in Mara's life. She showed up at school meetings. She sat beside Mara in county offices. She corrected people when they spoke about Mara as if she were not in the room. She did not excuse Mara's lying, stealing, running, or rage, but she also refused to reduce Mara to any of it. That should have taught Mara accountability. Sometimes it almost did. When Mara skipped school, Helen made her go back and apologize to the counselor she had cursed at. When Mara lied about where she had been, Helen did not scream, but she did not pretend the lie was harmless either. Survival explains some things, she told Mara once, driving through rain with both hands on the wheel. It does not fix what those things do to other people. Mara heard her, but hearing was not the same as changing. What Mara learned more deeply was how Helen listened. She noticed when Helen leaned forward, when her eyes softened, which details made her ask more questions, which silences made her wait instead of doubt. Mara did not think of it as manipulation then. She thought of it as staying safe. If the truth was messy, she could arrange it before handing it over. If a detail made her look cruel, she could leave it out until she understood whether the person across from her would survive knowing it. If a tear came at the right moment, she could let it fall. If it came at the wrong one, she could hold it back. Helen helped Mara enter a support group for girls who had been through hard homes, hard systems, and hard silences. The first night, Mara sat with her arms crossed while another girl spoke. Then another. Their stories were different from hers, but the room had a rhythm Mara recognized. Pain offered, pain witnessed, pain believed. When it was Mara's turn, she almost said nothing. Then she looked at Helen, sitting near the door, not pushing, not pleading. Mara opened her mouth and told the truth. Most of it. When she finished, the room was silent. Then one girl whispered, "You're strong." The words went through Mara like warmth. Strong. Not difficult. Not unstable. Not dishonest. Strong. For the first time, Mara saw a door back into the world. But she also saw something else. A room could change when she spoke. People could change when they believed her. And somewhere beneath gratitude, beneath relief, beneath the honest ache of finally being heard, another feeling stirred. Not healing. Power. Safe Harbor House did not look like the kind of place that could change a life. It sat behind a Methodist church on Maple Street, in a 2-story brick building that had once been a dentist's office and still smelled faintly of dust, coffee, and old pipes after rain. The sign out front was hand-painted blue, with white letters peeling at the edges. To Mara, it looked like a place that had learned to keep going anyway. Helen brought her there the spring after Mara turned 17. Not as a client, not exactly, and not as an employee. Helen called it volunteering. A few hours after school, folding donated clothes, making coffee, restocking paper cups, sitting at the front desk. "You are not here to save anybody," Helen told her. "You are here to learn how people are helped." For the first few weeks, Mara did. She learned where the spare blankets were kept, which cabinet held bus vouchers, which drawer had coloring books for children waiting while their mothers spoke behind closed doors. She learned not to stare when women arrived with sunglasses on cloudy days or with apologies already waiting in their mouths. Some told their stories in a rush. Some only sat with both hands around a paper cup, as if warmth were holding them together. Mara was good at the quiet parts. She knew when to slide tissues across a table without making it feel dramatic. She knew when a woman needed someone to say, "I believe you," and when that sentence would make her break apart, She knew how shame sounded when it tried to disguise itself as politeness. At first, the knowing hurt. Every woman who stepped through the door seemed to carry some piece of Mara's childhood in a different coat. Mara wanted to protect them. Not in a heroic way, in a hungry way, as if saving enough strangers might reach backward through time and save the girl with the blue notebook. Then people began to notice. A woman named Tessa asked for Mara the second time she came in. Another left a note that said, "She listened like she already knew." Reverend Paul Mercer mentioned Mara during a Sunday announcement, calling her a remarkable young woman who had turned pain into mercy. Someone squeezed her shoulder. Someone else whispered that she was brave. Brave was close to strong. Mara felt herself warming under it. By 19, she was working part-time at Safe Harbor. By 21, she had become the person donors wanted to meet. She stood beside Helen at church luncheons and community drives, speaking softly into microphones that squealed before settling. She never told the whole story of her childhood. A few details were enough. The notebook, the adults who looked away, the years of learning to survive inside systems built out of paperwork and doubt. The room always changed when she spoke. People stopped shifting in their chairs. Women reached into purses for tissues. Checks appeared afterward, folded discreetly into Helen's hand or mailed to the center the next week. Mara told herself the money proved the stories mattered. Maybe it did. But money was not the only thing those evenings gave her. They gave her a version of herself people could admire. Not the difficult foster child, not the girl who had stolen a locket and lied, not the teenager who had learned which silences made adults lean closer. A survivor, an advocate, a reason to believe the world could still correct itself. The first time Mara used someone else's story in a speech, she changed the name, she changed the town, she changed enough details that she told herself it no longer belonged to anyone. The woman had come to Safe Harbor in October with 2 children and a plastic bag of clothes. She had spoken to Mara in fragments, stopping often to apologize for crying. Mara had held her hand and meant every gentle word she said. 3 weeks later, standing at a fundraiser in the church basement, Mara told a version of that story. She made the ending cleaner. She made the woman sound more certain than she had been. She left out the part where the woman went back home twice before finally staying away. The audience needed hope, Mara thought. Donors needed to believe their money landed in a straight line between danger and safety. Afterward, the donation box was full. Helen praised the speech, but there was a crease between her eyes. "Did she give permission for you to share that much?" "I changed everything identifying," Mara said. "That is not what I asked. People donated because they understood." Helen's voice stayed gentle. Understanding is not the same as consent. The word stung because it made Mara feel small, like a child being corrected in front of an invisible room. A week later, Lydia Grant said almost the same thing. Lydia was 26, new to the center, with blunt-cut hair and a habit of asking questions after everyone else had agreed to move on. She believed in forms, signatures, boundaries, documented permission. She believed pain should not be made prettier for donors. "You have a gift," Lydia told Mara. "But sometimes you make people's stories sound like they belong to Safe Harbor instead of to them." Mara smiled without warmth. "That is a careful way to call me dishonest. It is a careful way to ask you to be careful." But Mara heard accusation. She heard file notes. She heard Mrs. Landry's hesitation, Denise Koppel's pen. Every adult who had treated inconsistency like proof of guilt. So she decided Lydia did not understand survival. The next fundraiser came in December. Mara spoke again. This time she blended 3 women's stories into one, changed the setting, softened one ending, sharpened another. The result was beautiful. Too beautiful. Maybe. The room went silent in exactly the way Mara knew it would. One woman from the center heard it from the hallway. She left before the applause ended. Mara saw her go. For a second, guilt rose up. She knew she had taken something that had not been offered. Then Reverend Mercer pressed an envelope of donations into her hand and said, "God is using your voice, Mara." The guilt folded itself into a smaller shape. Mara told herself the woman would be helped by the money. Other women would be helped. Children would sleep somewhere safe because of what Mara had said. If the story had been reshaped, It was only because the world did not respond to pain until someone gave it a form it could understand. By the time Mara locked the donation box that night, she had found a sentence strong enough to carry her past the shame. A little editing could save lives. It sounded almost true. That was why it was dangerous. The file was not supposed to be in Mara's hands. It had been packed in a cardboard box behind Helen Ward's old desk, underneath training manuals, outdated intake forms, and a broken label maker no one had thrown away. Safe Harbor House was preparing for a storage cleanout that Saturday, and Mara had volunteered to stay late, because volunteering to stay late was one of the easiest ways to look devoted without having to explain what you were avoiding. Helen had gone home an hour earlier. Lydia Grant was in the front office, arguing with the copy machine. Mara was alone in the records room when the bottom of the box split. Papers spilled across the floor in a pale, whispering mess. Most were harmless. Old attendance sheets, budget notes, printed emails with dates from years before Mara ever walked into Safe Harbor. Then she saw the name, Rachel Monroe. It meant nothing at first, only a girl's name on a county form. But beside it, in Helen's handwriting, were 3 words written so hard the pen had nearly cut through the paper. I miss this. Mara crouched there for a long time. She should have put the file back. She knew that. Even then, before she understood what she had found, she knew the papers belonged to a part of Helen's life that had not been offered. But the sentence pulled at her. I missed this. Mara opened the folder. There was no single terrible page. That was almost worse. Just a series of small failures stacked neatly. Concerns noted, calls made, a visit delayed, a supervisor's decision, a lack of evidence, a closing summary written in language too clean for what had happened after. Rachel had been 11. Helen had suspected the home was unsafe, but suspicion had not been enough to move the system quickly. By the time anyone acted, Rachel's life had already bent around the delay. The file did not make Helen a monster. That was the part Mara could not bear. If Helen had been cruel, Mara would have known what to do with the discovery. If Helen had ignored Rachel because she did not care, Mara could have placed her neatly beside every adult who had smiled, nodded, and looked away. But the file showed something harder. Helen had cared. Helen had tried. Helen had failed anyway. Mara sat back against the metal cabinet and felt a childhood door reopen. Because to Mara, failure and betrayal had always lived in the same room. Adults who failed to save you still left you unsaved. Their reasons did not warm the bed afterward. Their regret did not walk you out of the house. Their paperwork did not give back the years spent waiting for someone to be brave enough. When Helen found her there 20 minutes later, Mara had the folder open in her lap. Helen stopped in the doorway. For a moment, she looked older than Mara had ever seen her. You were not meant to see that, Helen said. Mara looked up. I know. That case was before you. Was she like me? Helen did not answer quickly enough. The silence became an answer Mara could use. She was, wasn't she? Helen came into the room and lowered herself into the chair beside the filing cabinet. She did not reach for the folder. Rachel was a child who needed more than the system gave her. And you were the system. Helen closed her eyes. Mara wanted the words to hurt. She hated herself for wanting it. Then she decided the hatred was proof the words were deserved. I was part of it, Helen said, and I have lived with that longer than you know. Mara laughed, but there was no humor in it. That is what adults always say after it is too late. Helen looked at her then, fully. Yes, sometimes it is. The honesty should have softened Mara. Instead, it frightened her. Helen had always been the one adult Mara could place outside the old pattern. The exception. The proof that someone could see a wounded child and choose differently. But Rachel Monroe's file made Helen human, and Mara did not know how to love a human being without preparing for disappointment. So when you helped me, Mara said, was that about me? Or was I just the child you finally managed not to lose? Helen's face changed. It was a cruel question because part of it came from a real wound. It was crueler because Mara knew that. Mara, Helen said, helping you was never about replacing anyone. But you needed me to be saved. No, I wanted you to live. The difference hung between them. Mara could have believed her. Some part of her almost did. But believing Helen now would mean accepting that people could fail and still love, could make mistakes and still tell the truth, could carry guilt without becoming enemies. Mara was not ready for a world that complicated. So she made it simpler. Helen had failed Rachel. Helen had hidden the file. Helen had built her gentleness out of guilt. Helen was not different from the others. She was only better at sounding sorry. That version hurt less. By Monday morning, Mara had placed the folder back in the box. She did not mention it to Lydia. She did not mention it to Reverend Mercer. She did not mention it to anyone. But she knew where it was. And knowing changed the balance between her and Helen. At the same time, Aaron Pike began asking questions. Aaron was not dramatic enough to feel dangerous at first. He was 32, narrow-shouldered, with wire-rimmed glasses, and the careful politeness of a man raised by a mother who made him write thank-you notes. He volunteered twice a week to help Safe Harbor organize its donation records because, as he told Helen, numbers made more sense to him than people did. Mara liked him well enough until he started noticing things. A grocery card logged twice. A hotel voucher, without a matching intake note. A speech transcript that described a woman's case differently than the private record did. None of it looked large by itself. Aaron said that more than once. He was not accusing anyone. He only wanted the files cleaned up before the annual donor report. Safe Harbor depended on trust, he reminded Mara, and trust became fragile when records got careless. Careless. The word landed badly. Mara heard something else beneath it. Messy. Unreliable. Not consistent. Not safe to believe. Aaron asked if they could sit down with Helen and Lydia for a quiet internal review. No need to scare anyone, he said. If there are mistakes, we fix them. Mistakes. Another gentle word with teeth. Mara told him she would think about it. That night, she stayed after closing and opened the locked cabinet where donor narratives were kept. She did not change anything. Not yet. She only read, comparing dates, names, quotes, the versions used in public newsletters, and the versions written in private intake notes. For the first time, she saw the distance between them all at once. It was not one lie. That would have been easier to confess. It was 100 small adjustments. A name softened here, a timeline tightened there, a woman's uncertainty turned into courage, a relapse left out, a return home removed because donors preferred rescue to be permanent. Mara sat under the buzzing fluorescent light and understood that Aaron was not wrong. Then she understood something worse. If Aaron was not wrong, Lydia had not been jealous. Helen had not been overcautious. The woman who left during the applause had not been ungrateful. They had all seen pieces of the thing Mara had refused to name. For almost 10 minutes, she considered calling Helen. She even picked up the phone. Then she thought of Rachel Monroe's file. Helen had failed a child and still became the woman people trusted to teach truth. Helen had been allowed complexity, regret, a second life. Why should Mara be destroyed for trying to make people care? The thought was unfair. She knew it was unfair while she was thinking it. But unfair thoughts can still become shelter when a person is desperate enough. Mara put the phone down. The next morning, when Helen asked if Aaron had spoken with her, Mara said yes. He is making things sound worse than they are, Mara told her. Helen studied hair. Isa? Mara felt the old fear rise. But now, beneath it, there was something else. The file. Rachel's name sat between them, though Helen did not know it. Mara lowered her voice. You know better than anyone what happens when a case gets judged from paperwork after the fact. Helen went very still. Mara hated herself for saying it. Then she watched the sentence do its work. Helen did not ask the next question. And Mara learned something she would later wish she had never learned at all. Even the people who taught you truth had places where they could be made quiet. Aaron Pike gave Mara 3 chances before he went to Helen. That was one of the facts she would later try not to remember. The first chance came on a Tuesday afternoon, when Safe Harbor was quiet except for the hum of the vending machine and rain ticking against the back windows. Aaron stood in the doorway of Mara's office with a folder held against his chest like he wished he had left it somewhere else. I think some of the donor files need to be reviewed, he said. Mara did not look up from her desk right away. She was writing thank you notes to a women's Bible group in Charleston, careful to make each card sound personal. Reviewed how? Carefully. Internally. Before the annual report. He said it gently. That was what made it feel like a threat. Aaron was not a man who filled a room. He apologized when he stepped around people in narrow hallways. He brought grocery store cookies to volunteer meetings and always took the broken one for himself. Nothing about him should have frightened Mara, but he had begun to see patterns. Not crimes, not yet. Not even accusations, just gaps. A card listed twice. A motel voucher with no matching intake note. A quote in a newsletter that sounded stronger than the handwritten record beneath it. A donor story that had the shape of one woman's life, but the ending of another's. Aaron did not call her a liar. He said, "I think we owe it to them." Mara heard, "I have found the places where your story does not hold." She folded the thank you card and placed it in an envelope. "Then clean it up," she said. "I can't do that alone." The second chance came 2 days later. Aaron asked if Mara would sit down with him, Lydia, and Helen after closing. No board members, no church donors, no police. Just a review before mistakes became something larger. Mistakes. Mara could have survived that word if it had come from someone else. From Aaron, it sounded almost merciful, and mercy made her angry. Mercy meant he thought he had the power to decide how badly she had failed. She told him she had a support group to prepare for. That was not exactly a lie. There was a support group. She did prepare for it. But the preparation took 20 minutes, and afterwards she sat in her car behind the building with both hands on the steering wheel, trying to convince herself that Aaron was the danger. Not the files, not her choices. Aaron. The third chance came the following Monday, when he waited near the back entrance with his coat half-zipped and his glasses fogged from the cold. "I don't want to hurt this place," he said. For a moment, Mara almost believed him. His voice was tired, not triumphant. He looked less like a man building a case than a man hoping someone would help him stop one from forming. There was still a door open between them. Narrow, but open. "If you have questions," Mara said, "ask Helen." "I did." Mara's stomach tightened. "And?" Aaron hesitated. She seemed worried. That was when Mara felt something in her turn. Not break. Breaking was too innocent a word. Turn. Helen had not protected her. Helen had gone quiet when Mara mentioned paperwork and Rachel Monroe, but not quiet enough. Somewhere inside that silence, Helen was still choosing the truth over Mara. So Mara chose first. She did not accuse Aaron that day. She was too careful for that. A direct accusation could be answered. A feeling was harder to challenge. At the next staff meeting, when Reverend Mercer asked about the donor report, Mara said, "Aaron has been asking some questions that are making a few women nervous." The room changed, but not dramatically. No one gasped. No one demanded proof. Lydia looked up sharply. Helen's face tightened. Reverend Mercer leaned back in his chair, troubled. "What kind of nervous?" he asked. Mara lowered her eyes, as if she regretted saying anything. "I don't want to speak for anyone." It was the kind of sentence that sounded respectful while inviting everyone else to imagine the missing parts. Lydia said, "Then maybe we should not discuss it without specifics." Mara nodded. "You're right." She let the agreement sit there, soft and obedient. Then she added, "I just think we have to be careful when men ask vulnerable women to explain themselves over and over." Aaron was not in the room. That made it easier for the sentence to become larger than him. Afterward, Lydia followed Mara into the hallway. "What are you doing?" Lydia asked. Mara turned. "Protecting clients." "No. You are implying something without saying it. If you are hearing something ugly, maybe ask yourself why." Lydia stared at her. "Because I know what implication sounds like." For a second, Mara saw danger in Lydia too. Not because Lydia had power, but because Lydia still believed words should be tied to what a person meant. Mara had stopped believing that long ago. Words were not stones. They were smoke. They moved through rooms and left people coughing without showing the hand that lit the fire. That evening, Cassie Rowe came in for her appointment. Cassie was 23, with bitten nails and a habit of folding her sleeves over her fists. She had been at Safe Harbor for 6 weeks, long enough to trust Mara's voice, but not long enough to trust her own. Her life had taught her that danger often arrived disguised as concern, so she searched every kindness for its hidden hook. Mara recognized that search. It made Cassie easy to care about. It also made her easy to harm. Cassie sat across from Mara and said she did not want to talk to Aaron anymore. Mara kept her face still. "Did something happen?" "I don't know." The honest answer should have been handled with care. Mara knew that. She knew uncertainty was not emptiness waiting for someone else to fill it. It was a fragile place. A person could grow there, or be planted with someone else's fear. Cassie rubbed her wrist. He asked about the voucher, then about dates. He kept saying it was just records, but I felt stupid, like I was messing everything up. Mara could have said Aaron was reviewing paperwork, not judging her. She could have said confusion did not mean danger. She could have helped Cassie separate embarrassment from harm. Instead, Mara leaned forward. "You are not stupid," she said. Cassie's eyes filled. "And if something in you felt wrong, we should respect that." The sentence was not false. That was what made it useful. Cassie nodded slowly, as if Mara had translated a feeling she had been afraid to name. Mara felt the old pull then, the one that had begun in support groups and church basements, the pull of being necessary to someone else's understanding of herself. But this time, there was a man's freedom on the edge of it. Mara saw that edge. She stepped closer anyway. Over the next weeks, the air around Aaron changed. People became polite in a careful way. Conversations paused when he entered rooms. Reverend Mercer suggested that perhaps Aaron should take a break from client-facing tasks, though Aaron had barely had any. Lydia objected. Helen asked questions. Mara answered with half-sad shrugs. No one had proof of anything. Proof was not needed yet. Mara had learned that a community could convict emotionally long before any court got involved. All it took was unease moving from one mouth to another until it felt like memory. Aaron finally confronted her outside Safe Harbor after a donor meeting. "You know what you're doing," he said. The words were quiet. That made them worse than shouting. Mara looked past him toward the parking lot, where Cassie was climbing into a church volunteer's car. "I know women here feel unsafe. Because you are making them feel that way." Mara turned back to him. There it was. The accusation at last. Not in legal language. Not in file notes. Plain enough that even a child could understand it. For a moment, guilt opened in her. Aaron looked exhausted. Not guilty. Not dangerous. Just tired and frightened by how quickly a good name could become a question mark. Mara knew that terror. She had lived inside it. She should have recognized him as someone being pushed toward the same cliff she had once stood on. Instead, she saw only the cliff behind herself. "If you cared about Safe Harbor," she said, "you would stop making this about you." Aaron's face changed. She had hurt him. She knew it before he looked away. That knowledge should have pulled her back. But the damage had begun to protect her. And protection is hard to surrender once it starts working. By the end of the month, Helen requested a formal review. Lydia wrote a private memo. Reverend Mercer worried about donors. Cassie repeated, in a trembling voice, that Aaron's questions had made her feel cornered, and Mara, who had once begged adults to understand that fear could make the truth come out crooked, let Cassie's fear harden into something it was not. She told herself she was holding the center together. She told herself Aaron would be fine if he had done nothing wrong. She told herself many things. But late at night, when the building was empty and the blue Safe Harbor sign creaked in the wind outside, Mara sometimes imagined Aaron in the doorway of her office, offering one more chance to tell the truth quietly. The memory always ended the same way, with Mara letting the door close. Helen Ward came to Mara after closing, when Safe Harbor House had gone quiet and the last coffee in the pot had turned black against the glass. She did not knock like a supervisor. She knocked like someone asking permission to grieve. Mara looked up from her desk. "If this is about Aaron, Lydia already wrote her memo." "I know. Then there is a process." Helen stepped inside and closed the door behind her. "I am not here for the process." That frightened Mara more than anger would have. Helen looked smaller under the office light. Not weak, just tired in a way that made all her years visible. Mara remembered the diner on Route 16, the tomato soup, Helen's hands wrapped around a coffee cup while rain ran down the window. She remembered wanting to believe that one adult could know the worst parts of her and stay. For a second, the memory almost worked. Then Helen placed a folder on Mara's desk. Not Rachel Monroe's file. Aaron's. "I read everything Lydia gave me," Helen said. "I spoke to Aaron. I spoke to Cassie's counselor. Mara, this has gone too far." Mara did not touch the folder. "You think I made it up? I think you are scared." and I think you have started using other people's fear to protect yourself." The words landed with awful precision. Mara stood. "You do not get to say that to me." "I do if it is true." The room seemed to narrow. Helen's voice shook, but she did not look away. Aaron asked questions about records. That is not the same as harming anyone. Cassie felt cornered because she is fragile, not because every feeling she has is evidence. You know the difference. Mara wanted to deny it quickly. A clean denial might have saved her from the silence that followed. But Helen knew her too well, and Mara knew too much. She did know the difference. That was the unbearable part. Helen moved closer. "There is still time." Mara laughed once. "For what?" "To correct the files. To tell the board what happened before this becomes a criminal case. To get Cassie independent help. To stop Aaron from carrying a story that does not belong to him." "And what happens to me?" Helen's face softened, and Mara hated that more than hardness. "There will be consequences. There it is. But I will stand with you if you tell the truth now." Mara looked at her, searching for the trap. "You would stand with me while they call me a fraud? I would stand with you while you become honest." The sentence opened something in Mara, then burned it. Honest, as if honesty were a room she could simply walk back into. As if she had not built years of work, speeches, donors, trust, and shelter out of stories that had been bent so gradually she could barely see where the bending began. As if one confession could separate the good she had done from the harm she had hidden inside it. "You want me to destroy Safe Harbor?" Mara said. "No. I want you to stop using Safe Harbor as a shield." Helen's eyes filled then, but she held her voice steady. "I loved you like a daughter in every way I was allowed to, but I will not help you do to Aaron what was done to you." There it was. The comparison. Mara felt it like a hand closing around her throat. Helen had placed her on the other side of the wound. Not the child outside the locked door, not the girl with the notebook. The adult holding someone else outside, deciding whose truth would matter. For one moment, Mara saw herself clearly. Aaron standing in her doorway, trying to fix the records quietly. Cassie looking to Mara for the shape of her own fear. Lydia asking careful questions. Helen sitting across from her now, offering not escape, but a way to stop becoming worse. Mara could have said yes. The word came close enough that she felt it behind her teeth. Then she thought of the courtroom that would come after. The donors. Reverend Mercer lowering his eyes. Women at the center, wondering whether every kind word from her had been another performance. She thought of the old labels returning with new proof. Liar. Difficult. Dangerous. Beyond help. And beneath all of that, she thought of Rachel Monroe. Helen's old failure sat in Mara's mind like a key. "You should be careful," Mara said quietly. Helen went still. Mara opened the bottom drawer and took out a copied page she had no right to have. She did not hand it over. She only let Helen see the name at the top. Rachel Monroe. The color left Helen's face. Mara's stomach twisted. Some part of her wanted Helen to shout, to call her cruel, to give her a reason to continue. But Helen only looked at the paper, then at Mara, and the sadness in her eyes was worse than any accusation. "You would use her?" Helen whispered. Mara heard herself answer from far away. "I learned from the best that old files can ruin a person if people read them the right way." Helen stepped back as if Mara had struck her. The silence after that was the last open door between them. Mara could still have taken it back. She could have torn the page, cried, confessed, begged Helen not to leave. Instead, she stood behind her desk with the paper in her hand and waited until Helen understood that the girl from the diner was no longer asking to be saved. By the end of the week, questions about Helen's handling of Rachel Monroe began moving through the board. Not loudly, not all at once, just enough to make her judgment look compromised. Just enough to move her out of the center of the Aaron review. Aaron's case did not slow. Cassie was referred to people who already trusted Mara's version of events. Lydia kept pushing, but without Helen's authority, her concerns sounded like office politics. Mara had won the week. She knew that. Yet the night Helen cleared the last box from her office, Mara watched from the hallway and felt no victory. Helen carried herself carefully, like a person holding broken glass inside her coat. At the door, Helen turned once. She did not speak. That was what Mara remembered most. Not anger. Not accusation. Just the silence of the last person who had still believed she could choose differently. By the time Aaron Pike's trial began, Ashford had already decided what kind of man he might be. Not allowed. Not in a way anyone could be sued for. The town had done it more quietly than that. A pause when he walked into a room. A mother pulling her daughter closer in the grocery aisle. A church volunteer saying she did not want to judge, then judging with every careful word that followed. Aaron's name had become one of those names people lowered their voices around, as if volume itself could make suspicion more polite. Mara watched it happen and told herself she had not caused all of it. That was true enough to be useful. She had not written every rumor. She had not forced Reverend Mercer to worry aloud about trust. She had not made every person in Ashford choose fear over patience. She had only opened the first door and let the town walk through. The courthouse smelled of floor polish and wet wool the morning Cassie testified. Rain moved against the windows in thin gray lines. Mara sat behind the prosecutor, hands folded, face composed in the expression people expected from someone who had guided frightened women through difficult truths. Cassie looked smaller on the witness stand. Her voice trembled. Sometimes she answered quickly. Sometimes she looked toward Mara before speaking. Only for a second, but long enough. Mara felt each glance like a thread tied around her wrist. She could still cut it. That knowledge lived inside her the whole morning. Cassie was not lying in the simple way people understood lying. She was trying to make sense of fear, embarrassment, memory, suggestion, and the need to be believed by the person who had become her anchor. Mara knew that. She knew Cassie had taken feelings that were real and placed them inside a shape Mara had helped build. Aaron's attorney tried to show the gaps. Dates that did not line up. Notes written after meetings. Statements that grew firmer over time instead of clearer. But every question made Cassie shrink. And every time she shrank, the jury saw a wounded woman being pressed too hard. Mara understood the terrible design of it. The weaker Cassie looked, the stronger the story became. At lunch recess, Aaron found Mara in the side hallway near the vending machines. For a moment, he looked like the volunteer who used to bring broken cookies to staff meetings and take the worst chair without complaint. Mara, he said, she should have walked away. Instead, she stopped. Aaron's suit hung loose on him. His glasses had slid down his nose. There were dark places beneath his eyes that had not been there before. "You know this isn't true," he said. The sentence was not angry. That made it harder to survive. Mara looked at the soda machine beside him, at the glowing buttons, at the small scratches around the coin slot. "Aaron, no. Please." His voice cracked and he swallowed it back. "I asked about records. That's all this was. You know that." She did. The truth stood between them, plain as a body in the road. Aaron stepped closer. Not enough to threaten, only enough to plead. "If there is any part of you that remembers what it feels like to have people decide what you are before you can speak, then say something." There it was. Note en accusation. A mirror. For a second, Mara saw the 8-year-old girl with the blue notebook. She saw Mrs. Landry's office, Elaine's tired smile, Denise Koppel's pen. She saw every adult who had chosen uncertainty because certainty would have required courage. Then she saw herself, not as the child. As the adult in the room, the realization almost broke her open. She could go back into the courtroom. She could say the records were incomplete. She could say Cassie had been vulnerable and that Mara had guided her too much. She could say Aaron had been asking questions because the files deserved questions. It would not undo everything, but it would stop the worst from becoming permanent. Her hand moved toward the courtroom door. Then she heard people in the hallway behind her. A donor from Charleston. A board member. Reverend Mercer's wife. People who still looked at Mara as if she were the steady one, the brave one, the woman who knew how to name harm when others were too afraid. If she spoke now, every name would turn. Survivor would become fraud. Advocate would become liar. Safe harbor would become evidence. And Mara would become exactly what the first adults had suspected she was. Damaged beyond trust. Aaron watched her face change. "You're not going to help me," he said. Mara wanted to answer. No words came. That was the choice. Not rage, not confusion, not a moment where she did not understand the stakes. Silence. She walked past him and returned to the courtroom. By late afternoon, the jury had seen enough of the story to believe the shape of it. When the verdict came, Nina Pike made a sound that seemed to leave her body before she could stop it. Aaron closed his eyes. Cassie covered her mouth and began to cry. Though Mara could not tell whether it was relief, fear, or some deeper part of her recognizing that the story had grown too large to belong to her anymore. Mara sat very still. People touched her shoulder after. They told her she had been strong. They told her justice was difficult but necessary. She nodded because nodding required less courage than speaking. That night, Safe Harbor House was dark when Mara returned. She stood outside beneath the blue sign, listening to it creak in the wind. Years earlier, the building had looked to her like a place that had learned to keep going anyway. Now it looked like a place holding its breath. Inside her office, Mara found an envelope pushed halfway under the door. No note. Only a photocopy of the first page from her old blue notebook, the childish handwriting uneven but clear. If I write it down, maybe somebody will believe me. Mara sat on the floor with the page in her lap until dawn. Regret came. It came hard, but regret arrived after Aaron had already been led away. Nina Pike did not free her brother with one discovery. Stories like to pretend truth arrived that way, clean and dramatic, with a single document slid across a table and a room falling silent. That was not how Aaron came home. It took years. It took letters no one answered, motions denied, boxes carried from one office to another, and Nina sitting at her kitchen table after midnight with court transcripts spread around cold coffee. It took her being called obsessed by people who had never lost a brother to someone else's certainty. Most of all, it took Dr. Samuel Keene. He was not a famous expert. He did not speak like a man trying to impress a jury. He was a trauma counselor, brought in on another case who agreed, as a favor to Nina's attorney, to look over Cassie Rowe's testimony and the Safe Harbor records. What he found was not a magic key. It was a pattern. Statements that became more certain after meetings with Mara. Notes written days after conversations they claimed to summarize. Donation stories that borrowed language from private sessions. Financial records that had been corrected, then corrected again, always in ways that protected the public image of the center and the woman at the center of it. Dr. Keene did not call Mara brilliant. He called the damage ordinary in the most frightening way. A respected person had been trusted too quickly. A frightened woman had been guided when she needed space. A community had mistaken the language of care for proof. And a man had lost years because too many people believed the right voice before asking the right questions. Cassie was the first piece of the wall to crack. By then, she was older, quieter, and tired of being treated like a symbol. In therapy outside Ashford, away from Safe Harbor and everyone who had already decided what her pain meant, she began to say the words she had been afraid of for years. I don't know if that was mine. Not everything. Not all at once. But enough. Enough for Dr. Keene to compare the early notes with the later statements. Enough for Lydia Grant's old memo to matter. Enough for Helen Ward to be called back from the edge of the town that had once trusted her, then blamed her, then preferred not to think about her at all. Helen walked into the hearing with white hair, a cane, and the same steady voice Mara remembered from the diner. She did not defend herself. She defended the truth. She admitted her failure in the Rachel Monroe case. She admitted that guilt had shaped the way she fought for Mara years later. She admitted she had seen signs too late at Safe Harbor because she had wanted to believe the child she saved had become the woman she hoped for. Then Helen looked at Aaron and said, "I am sorry I let my love for one wounded girl blind me to the man she was wounding." Aaron was exonerated 6 months later. The newspaper used that word because newspapers needed clean words. Exonerated. As if a word could walk into a prison cell and carry out all the years it had left behind. As if it could give Nina back the birthdays she spent driving to visits. As if it could return Aaron to the man who once brought broken cookies to staff meetings and believed paperwork was just paperwork. When he came home, there was no cheering crowd. Only Nina, waiting beside an old sedan in the county lot, one hand over her mouth. Aaron hugged her carefully, like a man afraid his own body might not remember gentleness. Mara's trial came after that. This time, the room did not belong to her. The prosecutor named Aaron Pike first, then Cassie Rowe, then Helen Ward, then the women whose stories had been reshaped for donors, the volunteers who had repeated suspicions they never understood, the community that had learned too late that compassion without accountability could become a weapon. Mara sat at the defense table with her hands folded. She looked older than the posters Safe Harbor had once printed of her. Smaller, too. There were moments when she seemed to listen honestly. There were moments when her face closed, as if some part of her still wanted to argue that she had done good, that people had been helped, that a broken system had forced her to make ugly choices. Maybe some of that was true. But truth is not a scale where one good thing cancels one ruined life. The judge said Mara's childhood mattered. The court did not pretend the little girl with the blue notebook had been protected. Adults had failed her. Systems had failed her. Her mother had taught her silence. Her town had taught her that discomfort could be stronger than courage. But the judge also said Mara had grown old enough to know what disbelief did to a human being. She knew what it was to have people decide your truth before you could speak. She knew what it was to be trapped inside someone else's version of you. She knew that confusion was not consent, fear was not proof, and a wounded person was not a tool. Then she had used all of it anyway. Mara Voss was sentenced to multiple decades in prison for perjury, fraud, obstruction, witness manipulation, falsified records, and related charges. There was no death sentence. No final speech large enough to swallow the room. Just a woman being held responsible for the years she had taken, the memories she had bent, and the trust she had turned into a weapon. When asked if she wished to speak, Mara stood. For a moment, everyone seemed to brace for the old voice. The soft one, the careful one, the voice that had made people lean closer. But Mara only looked at Aaron. "I am sorry," she said. Nina did not move. Aaron lowered his eyes. The apology stayed in the air, too small for what it was asked to carry. Years later, the blue notebook remained in an evidence box, sealed in plastic. On the first page, a child had written in uneven pencil, "If I write it down, maybe somebody will believe me." That sentence was still heartbreaking. It was still true, and it still did not forgive what Mara became. Because pain may explain where the darkness first entered, but it does not give anyone the right to pass that darkness on.